On the 14th of May, 1876, the Abilene stockyard was running at full spring drive noise, cattle and dust and the shout of buyers, when a 22-year-old woman named Pearl Crane was walked to the auction platform with her wrists tied and her chin up. The man who walked her there was her uncle, and the thing he was selling was 6 years of her life, priced at $50 to open. The auction was presented as a domestic service contract, which fooled no one on the platform and no one in the crowd. They all knew what a young woman on an auction platform with tied wrists meant, whatever the auctioneer called it. Pearl had decided, somewhere on the road to Abilene, that she was not going to look at the crowd. She was going to look at the roofline above their heads and hold her chin level and give Earl Crane nothing. Not a flinch, not a tremor, not a single visible acknowledgement that this was the worst thing that had been done to her in 4 years of bad things, which was saying something. She was counting the slats in the roofline when the room went quiet. The particular silence that falls on a crowd when someone does the obvious thing that everyone else was not going to do. The dry goods goes exactly that quiet. The stockyard goes exactly that quiet. She looked down. A man was at the base of the platform stairs with one hand on the rail, looking up at her. She had never seen him before. He was trail-worn and tall, and had the weathered face of a man who has spent years doing outdoor work, and was not in the habit of explaining himself. He was looking at her with the focused attention of someone who has seen something that requires addressing, and has decided to address it. He was not looking at her the way the crowd was looking at her. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something that has gone wrong that he is going to fix. She did not know what to do with that. She held her chin level and looked back at him. He said to the auctioneer, "What's the bid standing at?" The auctioneer, who was not going to have a stranger stop his auction, said, "47, sir, and still going." The man said, "53. Done." The auctioneer froze mid-gesture. The crowd was very quiet. Earl Crane, visible at the back edge of the crowd, was doing calculations on his face that Pearl could read even from the platform. The man, she would learn his name was Jed Holt, stepped up onto the platform and took Pearl's elbow in a way that was not a grip, but a direction, and walked her off the platform and through the crowd to the edge of the stockyard, and the crowd parted, and Earl Crane did not follow. Outside in the Abilene street, Jed Holt reached into his coat and produced a belt knife and cut the rope from Pearl's wrists in one clean motion. Then he reached into his other pocket and produced the indenture paper, folded, and held it out to her. She said, "What is that?" He said, "Your contract. It's yours. Do what you want with it." She took it. She looked at it, the document that had been sold over her head, as if she were not present in the negotiation. The paper that had been the entire legal reality of her situation until approximately 4 minutes ago. She said, "What does that mean? Do what I want with it." He said, "It means nobody owns it but you." She looked at him. He was not looking at her with the expression that had been directed at her all day, not the crowd's look, and not Earl's look, and not the hired bidder's looks. He was looking at her as if she were a person he had just met and was waiting to learn more about. She said, "Why did you do that?" He said, "That man was making a fool of himself in my town." I objected. She said, "It's not your town." He said, "I pass through it twice a year." Close enough. He picked up her flour bag, which the auctioneer's man had set down at the base of the platform stairs, and held it out to her. She looked at it. She took it. She said, "I don't accept charity." He said, "I know. It's not charity. I bought that contract because the alternative was watching the auctioneer finish his call and the winner walk off with you, and I wasn't willing to do that." She said, "That's charity." He said, "It's a business transaction. I bought a document. The document is yours. That's the transaction." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "That's not how transactions work," he said. "It is today." She thought about arguing this further and decided against it. She folded the indenture paper differently than Earl had folded it, a deliberate act, remaking the document's physical shape under her own hands, and put it in her coat pocket. She said, "I have nowhere to go." He said, "That's a problem." She said, "It is." He said, "I can offer you an employment arrangement. I run a ranch in the Texas Hill Country. I need a cook for the cattle season. The pay is fair, and there's a clause that says either party can end the arrangement on 2 weeks' notice." He paused. "That's the most important part. You can leave." She said, 2 weeks. He said, 2 weeks. "Written in the contract, signed by both parties, enforceable." She said, "Who would I enforce it with?" He said, "Anyone you want. The contract is real. I mean it to be real." She stood in the Abilene street with the indenture paper in her coat pocket and the flour bag in her hand and thought about it. She thought about it the way she had learned to think about things in 4 years of being in situations where thinking carefully was the only power she had, systematically. With attention to what was actually being offered, rather than what it felt like to be offered it. What was being offered was pay, and a 2-week exit, and a ranch in the Texas Hill Country, and a man who had spent $53, the last of his drive payment, she would learn later, because he was not willing to let the auctioneer finish his call. She thought about what 4 years in Earl Crane's household had cost her, and what 6 years of an indenture contract would have cost, and what $53 was to a trail boss at the end of a Chisholm drive. She said, "All right." He said, "All right." That was the agreement. But to understand how Pearl Crane came to be standing on that platform, with her wrists tied and her chin raised, we have to go back 4 years, to the morning her stepfather's relatives arrived and explained to her, through the act of going through the house deciding what was theirs, exactly what she was not. Pearl's stepfather, a man named Duncan Holt, who was no relation to Jed, had died when she was 18, and his relatives had come the morning after the funeral from 3 different counties, in a coordinated way that suggested they had been in communication about the situation before they arrived. They went through the house with the focused efficiency of people with a clear idea of what they were looking for. The furniture, which had been her stepfather's before the marriage. The livestock, which had been worked and built up over 7 years partly by Pearl's own labor. The tools in the barn. The seed stock set aside for the spring planting. They went through it all with the particular indifference of people who have decided that a stepdaughter is not a fact they need to account for. Pearl had watched from the doorway of her room, which was too small to be worth their attention, and done the accounting she was always doing. What she had, what she was worth to anyone, what her options were. What she had, the clothes on her back, the contents of her room, skills enough for any domestic service arrangement, a quick intelligence that she had learned to keep mostly quiet. What she was worth to her stepfather's relatives, nothing they needed to account for. Options, limited. She had packed her bag before they finished going through the main room. She had been in her Uncle Earl's household by the following week, working for room and board at the same rate her stepfather's household had given her, which was to say at no rate, in the sense of wages, just room, just board, just the ongoing arrangement that she would work for the fact of being housed. She had been there 4 years when the debts caught up with Earl. The 3 weeks between the debt announcement and the Abilene plan, she had not known about the plan. She had not known about the indenture paper, or the auction, or the $50 opening bid. She had known that something was coming, Earl had the look of a man solving a problem, and she had learned in 4 years to read that look very carefully. But she had not known the specific shape of it until he told her to get in the wagon the morning of May 14th, and she had looked at his face and understood. She had gotten in the wagon with her chin up and had not looked at him for the entire ride to Abilene. The 3-week trail drive south to the Texas Hill Country was where Jed Holt and Pearl Crane had their first real conversations, which did not go smoothly. Pearl did not believe in the employment contract. She had read it 4 times, looking for the catch. Because there was always a catch, and she had signed it because it was the best option available to her. And she had told herself that 2 weeks' notice meant she could leave if the catch showed itself within the first 2 weeks. She waited for the catch. She asked Jed direct questions. She argued about the route. She refused help with her saddle roll on principle, and then had difficulty with the saddle roll and accepted no assistance. Jed answered every direct question directly. He did not fill the silences she left with reassurances, which she had learned to distrust completely. He helped with the saddle roll exactly once, on the 4th day, in a matter-of-fact way that said, "The saddle roll is tangled and I can fix it faster than you can from your angle. Not, you need my help." She let him fix it. She did not thank him, because she was still looking for the catch. She said, on the 7th day at a campfire outside Wichita, "Why did you spend your drive payment on a stranger?" He had been quiet on the subject since Abilene. He poured coffee into his cup and said, "I've done a lot of right things in my life that cost me something. Most of them I'd do again. That one didn't cost enough to matter." She said, $53 is not nothing. He said, "No, it's not nothing, but it's replaceable." He drank his coffee. "You're not." She looked at the fire. She said, "You don't know that. You don't know me." He said, "No." But the situation was clear enough. She said, "People do right things for reasons." He said, "Yes." She said, "What's yours?" He said, "I told you." The alternative was watching the auctioneer finish his call. She said, "That's not a reason. That's a description of what you didn't want." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "People shouldn't be property. That's the reason. Everything else is description." She looked at the fire for a long time. She said, "All right." He said, "All right." That was about the most agreement they had reached in 7 days. The hill country of Texas in late May was cedar and limestone, and the Pedernales River going green in the early summer, and it was nothing like Kansas or the trail, and it was the most beautiful thing Pearl had seen in 4 years. She had been in Kansas her whole life, which was flat and big, and not unfriendly, but not like this. The cedar-covered hills rolling south, the limestone bluffs above the river, the enormous Texas sky above it all. She looked at it from the wagon seat and did not say anything about it. But she noticed. Luz Morales met them at the Holt Ranch gate. She was a Mexican-American woman in her 40s, with the unhurried directness of someone who has been doing her job for a long time and knows exactly how to do it. And she looked at Pearl for approximately 30 seconds and then showed her the kitchen, the garden, the spring, and the good saddle in the barn without being asked or prompted, as if introducing a new resident rather than a new employee. Pearl said, "Thank you." Luz said, "Don't thank me. Thank the man who pays my wages." Pearl thought about that. She said, "Have you worked here long?" Luz said, 6 years. Since before the wife died. Pearl said, "There was a wife?" Luz said, "Fever, 5 years ago. He runs the place alone since." Pearl looked at the kitchen. Well-maintained, well-stocked for a ranch of this size. The kind of kitchen that is run by someone who knows what a kitchen needs. She said, "He's been managing alone?" Luz said, "Him and me and whoever he hires for the drives. He's fair." He pays what he says, on time, always. Pearl pulled out the employment contract from her coat and looked at the wages line. She had looked at it 4 times already. It was generous without being insulting. She put it back. She said, "He always pays on time?" Luz said, "Always." Pearl thought, that is a data point. She spent the first week at the Holt Ranch in a systematic process of calibration. She cooked the meals. She was a good cook, having had no choice about becoming one, and kept the kitchen and did the work in the contract and watched, carefully and at an angle, the way things operated here. She watched how Jed managed the 2 spring hands he had, and whether he raised his voice at them he did not, and whether he paid them what he had promised he did, and whether he treated them as people or as labor he treated them as people. She watched how he managed the livestock and the water situation in the property, and whether he cut corners he did not. She watched how he spoke to Luz, the way one person who has worked together for a long time speaks to another, directly, with respect, without condescension. She was looking for the catch. She did not find it in the first week. She did not find it in the second week. And the 2-week notice period came and passed without her invoking it, which she noticed and thought about for several days. She said, on the 16th day, to Luz, "He's not what I expected." Luz said, "What did you expect?" Pearl said, "Someone with a catch." Luz said, "What kind of catch?" Pearl said, "The kind where the good behavior at the beginning is the price of the good behavior stopping." Luz was quiet for a moment. She said, "He's been the same for 6 years, the same before you came and the same since. He doesn't have a different face for different situations." Pearl thought about this. She said, "Everyone has a different face for different situations." Luz said, "Some people, not him." Pearl read the employment contract again that evening. The 2-week notice clause. She had read it so many times she had it memorized. She knew every line in it. She also knew now that it said what it said because Jed Holt had written it that way on purpose, had sat down and written it specifically so that the arrangement she was entering would be one she could leave. She had thought at first that this was how all employment contracts were written. She had since learned from Luz that Jed had written this contract specifically for her situation, that the previous hands he had hired had arrangements nothing like this one. He had written a contract designed to let her leave. She had not left. She thought about that for a long time. The morning she found the neighboring rancher's wife on the Holt Ranch porch was the morning something in Pearl straightened permanently. The woman had come with a casserole, the neighborly gesture of a woman bringing food to a new situation, and she said to Pearl, with every appearance of kindness, "You must be so grateful to Mr. Holt for what he did. Most men wouldn't have." "Well, you know," Pearl said, "I'm grateful to Mr. Holt for a fair employment arrangement and a kitchen that is adequately stocked. I am not grateful to him or to any man for the money he spent making legal what should never have been illegal to begin with. The only thing I owe him is the fair rate for the work I do, and I intend to deliver it." The woman left somewhat flustered. Jed had been in the barn. He had heard it through the window. That evening he put the employment contract on the kitchen table, with a notation in the margin, "Terms acceptable to both parties, revise as needed." Pearl looked at the contract for a long time. She did not revise it. She picked it up and put it back in her coat pocket and went to start supper, and Jed, who had come in from the barn by then, poured himself coffee and sat at the table and did not say anything about any of it. She thought, this is what a man looks like when he is not keeping score. She thought, I don't know what to do with that. She thought, I am going to figure it out. Earl Crane appeared at the Holt Ranch gate in late June. Pearl saw him from the kitchen window before anyone else did. She always watched the gate in those days, had watched it since her arrival, because watching gates was a habit she had developed over 4 years of uncertainty, and she recognized him immediately. The particular way he sat a horse, the expression of a man who has convinced himself he is in the right. He had a paper. He held it up when he saw her. A letter, he said, was from a Missouri lawyer, and he said the indenture paper was not legally void, and that Jed Holt's purchase had been irregular, and that Pearl was to come home with him. Pearl pulled her coat on. Jed was in the barn. She did not call him. She walked to the gate herself. She said, "Show me the letter." Earl handed it through the gate. She read it. She had spent 6 weeks at the Holt Ranch with the employment contract, reading it carefully, looking for every clause and considering every implication. In the process of understanding the employment contract, she had also read the section of it that described what constituted a valid labor agreement and what did not, because she needed to know whether Jed's contract was any different from Earl's, and in reading that, she had learned the relevant law. She read Earl's lawyer's letter. She read the specific claim it made. She said, "This letter claims the indenture paper is valid because I was party to the original employment described in it. I was not party to the original employment. I did not sign the indenture paper. My name appears in it, but my signature does not. That is not a contract under Kansas or Texas law, and any lawyer your friend has will know that." Earl said, "Now see here," she said. "I would also ask your friend's lawyer what the penalty is for falsifying a service registry contract and misrepresenting the age and consent status of the subject. Those are specific violations with specific fines. Your friend may want to know that before you pursue this further." Earl went pale. She said it again, more slowly, the falsification, the registry misrepresentation, the penalty. Earl Crane looked at the gate. He looked at Pearl. He looked at the paper in his hand, which was his lawyer's letter. He looked at Pearl again. Jed was standing behind her, at the gatepost, not touching her, not speaking. He had come up from the barn when she had not called him. Because he had noticed the gate from the barn window and had come quietly and stood back. He had not interfered. He had simply been present. Earl rode away without another word. Pearl turned around. Jed was at the gatepost with the expression she had been learning to read over 6 weeks, the steady, uncomplicated expression of a man who has seen what he needed to see and has drawn his conclusions. It was not pride in himself. It was not relief. It was something more direct than both. She thought, "He is proud of me." She thought, "I do not know the last time someone was proud of me." She thought, "I would like to not have to think about when the last time was." She said, "He's gone." Jed said, "I know." She said, "He won't come back." He said, "No." She looked at the gate, at the road that went toward Abilene and Kansas, and everything that had been before. Then she turned away from it and looked at the hill country in the long June afternoon, the cedar rolling south, the Pedernales glinting below the bluffs, the enormous Texas sky. She said, "I'd like to burn the paper." He said, "The indenture paper." She said, "Yes." He said, "It's yours. Your call." That evening she took the indenture paper from her coat pocket, the paper she had been carrying for 6 weeks, the paper she had refolded in the Abilene street, with her own hands, that she had read and reread until she knew every clause in it, and she burned it in the fireplace. Jed sat at the kitchen table and watched her do it. He watched it without comment until the paper was ash. Then he said, "I'd like you to stay." "Not in the contract." Here she looked at the ash for a moment. She thought about the contract in her coat pocket, the one she had not revised. She thought about the 2-week notice clause she had not invoked. She said, "I know. I've been waiting for you to say it right." He said, "Was that right?" She said, "Close enough." They married in September 1876, Luz and Burl from a neighboring spread as witnesses. The employment contract was the kindling for the next morning's stove fire. Pearl put it in herself. And the ranch had 2 names on the deed by the following spring, filed with the county in Pearl's own handwriting. The thing she had wanted, in those weeks of reading the contract and watching the gate and waiting for the catch, to be a person and not a price, to be someone's partner and not someone's arrangement, to stand at a gate on her own ground and say the thing that needed saying without anyone's permission. She had all of it now. She stood at the Holt Ranch gate in the early morning sometimes, looking out at the cedar and limestone and the Texas sky, and thought about the Abilene stockyard and the platform and the $53 and the question she had asked at the gate when Earl came back. She had not needed help with that question. She had built it herself, in 6 weeks of careful reading and watching. Jed had been behind her, just present, just there. That was not nothing. That was everything it needed to be. If this story found you today, if Pearl's specific earned anger, or Jed's particular way of stepping back without stepping away, found its way to you, stay with us. There are more stories here, and every one of them is about someone standing at their own gate and knowing the answer. Before she burned the indenture paper, there had been weeks of watching and of learning what the Holt Ranch was. The hill country was different from Kansas in ways that Pearl cataloged the way she cataloged everything, methodically, without sentiment, filing each detail under what it meant. The cedar scrub was not the flat grass of the Abilene country. It caught the light differently, held it, broke it into patches of shade. The limestone bluffs above the Pedernales were the color of old bone, and the river below them ran cold even in the June heat. The air smelled of cedar and something flinty, the smell of rock near water. She had not expected to care about any of this. She had not expected to look out at the hill country in the late afternoon and feel anything other than the calculation of a woman assessing a new situation. She looked out at the hill country in the late afternoon and felt something she had almost no experience with, the specific warmth of finding a place that fit. She did not trust this feeling. She had not had enough experience with things that fit to know how reliable the feeling was. She filed it under data to be monitored. She monitored it for 6 weeks. The data was consistent. On a Tuesday in the 3rd week, Luz showed Pearl the kitchen garden. They had been working together in the kitchen since Pearl's arrival, and the arrangement had settled into the easy parallel competence of 2 women who both know what they are doing and have figured out each other's rhythms. Luz did the heavier work in the kitchen, the butchering, the larger baking, and Pearl managed the accounts side of the kitchen work, which Luz was happy to leave to her. The kitchen garden was behind the house, walled on 2 sides by limestone, warm in the long summer days. Luz had been cultivating it for 6 years, and it was the garden of a woman who knew what she was doing. Orderly rows of beans and squash and peppers, herbs along the wall, the soil dark and worked. Pearl stood in the garden and looked at it. She said, "How long did this take to establish?" Luz said, 2 years for the soil. This country is limestone underneath. You have to work to get it to hold. Pearl said 2 years. Luz said, worth it. Pearl thought about 2 years. About the slow, incremental work of building something in difficult ground. About the fact that Luz had still been here, 2 years into a soil project, which meant she had believed it would pay off. She said, "You stayed 2 years just to get the garden going." Luz said, I stayed because this is a good place to stay. The garden was something to do while I was here. Pearl looked at the beans. She said, "What makes it a good place to stay?" Luz looked at her. She said, "What do you mean?" Pearl said, "I mean, what is the specific thing that makes you say this is a good place? Not the garden. The place." Luz was quiet for a moment, the way she was quiet when she was taking something seriously. She said, "Nobody here asks you to be less than you are. That's the thing. In 6 years, nobody here has asked me to be less than I am, or less than I can do. That's not as common as it sounds." Pearl thought about that for the rest of the afternoon and into the evening. Nobody asked you to be less than you are. She had been asked to be less than she was for 4 years. Not in words, Earl Crane had never said, "Be less." But the situation he had put her in was a situation designed for a woman with no opinions, no skills that mattered, no capacity for the things Pearl had capacity for. The situation had been designed for something smaller than Pearl. And Pearl had not fit in it, and the friction of not fitting had been the thing that hurt most. She thought, "I fit here." She thought, "That is the data I have been monitoring. That is what the data shows." She went to start supper. On a Saturday, in the 4th week, Pearl went with Luz to the Fredericksburg market for supplies. Fredericksburg was the nearest town of any size, 12 miles southeast, and it had a dry goods and a feed store, and a church, and the specific social texture of a German settler community that minded its own business with the industrious thoroughness of people who have come a long way to be left alone and intend to stay that way. Pearl found she liked it. The people in the Fredericksburg market spoke to Luz with the same straightforward respect they spoke to each other, which was not always true of towns Pearl had been in. And they spoke to Pearl, once Luz had introduced her as from the Holt Ranch, with the brisk practicality of people who were interested in whether you were useful, not in what you were doing there. A woman at the dry goods counter said, "You're at the Holt place then? Good outfit. Fair rate?" Pearl said, "Fair rate." The woman said, "Good." She weighed out the flour and made change with the precision of a woman who had been doing it for 20 years and saw no reason to be imprecise. The Holt place has always been fair. People know that. Pearl said, "Have they?" The woman said, "Since before the wife died. He's been here 10 years. People know." Pearl picked up the flour. She thought, people know. 10 years, and people know. That is what 10 years of being what you say you are builds. She thought about the employment contract, and the wages paid on time, and lose 6 years in the kitchen garden, and people know. She thought, there is a version of evidence that takes a long time to accumulate and cannot be faked. This is that version. She put the flour in the wagon and thought about that the whole drive back. Jed had asked her, on the 5th day of the trail drive, why she had been in Earl Crane's household. Not what had happened. He had the shape of it from Abilene. But why she had been there in the first place. It was the first personal question he had asked her. She had told him about her stepfather and the relatives and the morning after the funeral. She had told it the way she told everything in those early days. As a ledger entry, no self-pity, just the numbers. He listened to all of it. He said, 4 years, she said. Yes. He said, you stayed 4 years, she said. I didn't have somewhere else to go. He said, you do now. She had looked at the hill country road ahead of them and said yes. That had been on the trail. She had not known then whether she believed it. She had been in the process of learning whether she believed it. By the end of the 4th week at the Holt Ranch, she believed it. The morning of the Fredericksburg market run, before they left, Jed had said to Pearl, take the good horse. The brown one. He'll make the market road easy. It was the good horse. She had noticed it in the barn, the well-made animal, the one that was worth more than the others. He was offering it without being asked. She took the good horse. She thought, on the market road he gives things without keeping a list of what he's given. That is what 4 years with Earl Crane taught me to watch for, the list. The running account of what you owe. He doesn't have a list. She thought, that is not easy to find. She thought, I have found it. On the day she faced Earl at the gate, the morning had started with a particular clarity. She had woken early, she always woke early, and gone to the kitchen and started the fire, and while the fire was building she had stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the hill country in the pre-dawn dark. The cedar was a black shape against the darker sky. The limestone bluffs were invisible. The Pedernales was somewhere below, making its cold sound over the stones. She had thought, standing at the kitchen window, I live here. Not I am staying here, not I have been here, not the provisional assessment of a woman who is still looking for the catch. Just, I live here. This is where I live. It was the first time she had thought that in 4 years. She had been thinking it when she saw Earl at the gate an hour later. That was why she had put on her coat and walked to the gate herself, without calling for Jed, without a plan except, I live here, and he is at my gate. She had walked to the gate because it was her gate, and the ground between the house and the gate was her ground, and she was the one who was going to say what needed saying. Jed had been there, behind her, just present. She thought about that sometimes, in the months after, the specific way he had been present. Not ahead of her, not beside her, not speaking for her, just behind her. Available, ready, not needed, as it turned out, but there. She thought, that is the right way to stand behind someone. She thought, I would like to be stood behind that way for the rest of my life. She had told him so, eventually. Not in those exact words, she was not a woman given to that exact kind of speech, but in the way she had of saying true things plainly. She had said, on a September evening sitting on the Holt Ranch porch, that she had come to Texas not knowing what she was looking for, and had found something she had not known to look for, and that she intended to stay. He had said, I know. She had said, you've known for a while. He had said, since the gate. She said, I hadn't decided at the gate. He said, I know. But I had. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the direct, uncomplicated expression she had learned over 14 weeks to read as simply, this is what I think, without apology, without performance. She said, what had you decided? He said that I wanted to ask, and that I was going to wait until you were ready. She said, how did you know when I was ready? He said, you burned the paper. She thought about the fireplace, and the ash, and the specific satisfaction of watching the indenture paper become something that could never be used against her again. She thought about what it had felt like to put it in the fire. Not anger, not revenge, just this is done. This chapter is done. She said, that's when you knew. He said, yes. She said, I was ready before that. He said, I know, but I wanted you to have the burning. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought, he waited so I could have the burning. He wanted me to be the one who did it. He could have burned it himself. It was technically his document, but he waited. She said, all right. He said, is that yes? She said, yes. They married in September 1876. Luz and Burl from a neighboring spread as witnesses. The hill country in September was still warm, but with the first edge of autumn in the evenings, the cedar smelling different as the nights cooled. The Pedernales slower than it had been in the summer heat. The sky was enormous and very blue. The limestone bluffs were gold in the afternoon light. Pearl stood at the Holt Ranch gate after the wedding, the same gate where Earl Crane had not gotten through, the same gate she had walked to herself in her coat on a June morning, and looked out at the hill country. 2 names on the deed by spring, filed in Pearl's own handwriting, her ground, her gate. She thought about the indenture paper, which was ash. She thought about the employment contract, which was kindling now, put in the stove by her own hand on the morning after the wedding. She thought about 4 years in Earl Crane's household and the specific costs of those years, which she had done the accounting of many times. She thought, the accounting comes out different now. She thought, I have been doing the wrong accounting. She thought about Jed on the other side of the gate, in the ranch house, doing something practical that needed doing, which was what he was always doing. She thought about the $53 he had spent in Abilene, and the contract he had written so she could leave, and the gate he had stood behind her at, and the paper he had waited for her to burn. She thought, that is not the accounting of a man who sees you as a transaction. She thought, I always knew that. I was waiting to trust that I knew it. She turned away from the gate and walked back toward the house, her house, on her ground. The hill country spread around her in every direction, cedar and limestone, and the river somewhere below, and she thought, this is where I live. She thought, I live here. She thought, finally. In October, a neighboring rancher named Eckhart came to call. He was a large, sun-darkened man with 300 acres along the Pedernales and a reputation for straight dealing, and he came to congratulate Jed on the wedding and to look at Pearl with the frank assessment of a man who has heard a story and wants to see if the fact matches the telling. He shook Pearl's hand at the door. He said, I heard about Abilene. She said, most people have. He said, I heard you handled the man at the gate yourself. She said, yes. He said, Earl Crane. I know his type. He said it with the specific contempt of a fair-dealing man for the unfair variety. You made the right argument. She said, I read the law. He said, that's the right tool. He glanced at Jed and then back at Pearl. He said, you're running the accounts? She said, yes. He said, Holt always ran them himself. She said, he's running them with me now. Eckhart nodded in the way of a man who has decided something satisfactory. He said to Jed, good match. Jed said, I know. Eckhart stayed for coffee, and they talked about the fall cattle situation and the water table in the hill country autumn. And Pearl sat at the table with her coffee and thought about the phrase good match, which Eckhart had used as if it were the highest available compliment, which perhaps for him it was. She thought, I have been matched with things before. I have been matched with households and arrangements and situations, and none of them were matches in the way Eckhart meant. In the way of 2 people who fit together, in the specific sense that each one is better for the presence of the other. She looked at Jed, who was talking about the water table with Eckhart, with the focused attentiveness he brought to everything that was real. He was not performing anything. He was just talking about the water table. She thought, this is what it looks like when someone is simply what they are. She thought, I have not met that before. Eckhart left. Luz brought the coffee cups in from the porch. Pearl washed them. Jed came into the kitchen and poured himself the last of the coffee from the pot, and sat at the table and looked at the accounts Pearl had been working on before Eckhart arrived. He said, Eckhart likes you. She said, Eckhart has decided I am useful, which is what he meant. Jed said, he meant both. She said, he doesn't know me well enough to like me. Jed said, he knows enough. He knows you read the law and held the gate. That's enough for Eckhart. Pearl thought about that. She said, is that enough for you? What I can do? He looked up from the accounts. He said, what? She said, I'm asking. what it is for you. He was quiet for a moment. He said no. She waited. He said, it's not what you can do, it's what you are. The doing is how you show it. The doing is how I knew. But what He stopped. He said, I would have known from the Abilene platform. Before you said anything. Before you did anything. I would have known from the way you held your chin. She said, that's not a rational basis for. He said, no, it's not. He looked at the accounts again. I've had 5 years of rational basis. The ranch is well run, and the accounts are in order, and Luz is a good cook, and the Pedernales country is good grass. That's the rational basis. The chin is something else. She said, the chin. He said, the chin. She thought about standing on the Abilene platform, looking at the roofline, holding her chin level. She had not thought of that as strength at the time. She had thought of it as the only thing she had left. She thought, he saw what I had left, and he thought it was worth $53. She thought, I would have paid more for that. She set the account book on the table in front of him and went to start supper. The hill country in November was cooler and quieter, the cattle season winding down, the spring hands gone to winter work elsewhere, the Holt Ranch settling into the smaller household of the 3 of them. Jed did the winter maintenance work that the cattle season left no time for, and Pearl managed the kitchen and the accounts, and began, with Luz's collaboration and Jed's general approval, to reorganize the kitchen garden plan for spring planting. She had not planned the garden. She had not planned a great many things. She had arrived in Abilene with a chin up, and nothing else in 6 years of her life had been sold from under her. And she had not planned the man at the base of the platform, or the trail south, or the hill country, or the kitchen garden that would need 2 years of soil work before it was right. She planned it now. She sat at the kitchen table with the garden plan in the November evenings, and drew the rows and noted the soil amendments, and calculated what would need to go in first to build the ground for the following spring. And Luz looked at the plan and said, you're thinking 2 years out. Pearl said, yes. Luz said, good. You can't think less than 2 years out in this soil. Pearl said, I know. She did know. She had been told, and she had understood what it meant immediately, because 2 years was not very long for something that was going to last. She thought, I have been thinking in the very short term for 4 years. Just survive this arrangement, manage this situation, get through this week. No planning, no 2 years out. She thought, I can think 2 years out now. She thought, I can think further than that. She drew the bean rows on the garden plan, the specific spacing that Luz had taught her, the distance from the wall that would give them the most of the summer heat without burning. She drew it carefully, the plan of a garden that would not be producing fully for 2 seasons, in a house where she intended to be for longer than 2 seasons. The lamp was warm on the table. Jed was across from her, doing the winter maintenance inventory, his handwriting steady in the account book. Luz was in the kitchen, the sounds of the end-of-day work coming through the door. This was what it looked like. The November evening, the lamp, the garden plan, the man across the table with his account book. Pearl Crane, 22 years old, at a table in the Texas Hill Country, planning 2 years out. This was what it looked like when someone had finally arrived somewhere they could think in that direction. If this story found you today, if Pearl's particular stubbornness, or Jed's quiet, $53 certainty, settled somewhere in you, stay with us a little longer. There are more stories here, and every one of them is about someone who found their gate and stood at it. In the winter evenings, Luz sometimes told Pearl about the previous women who had come through the Holt Ranch. Not the 2 who had come before Pearl, Luz did not speak of those directly, but over coffee in the kitchen, in the manner of women exchanging the history of a place. Luz told Pearl about the Holt Ranch in the years before Jed's wife died, and about the wife herself, whose name had been Clara. Clara had been a San Antonio woman, practical and good-natured, who had come to the hill country willingly and had made the ranch into what it was. The kitchen garden started under her hands, the cookhouse organized by her. The particular way the main room was arranged that Jed had not changed in 5 years. Luz had come a year before Clara died, hired by Clara, and she told Pearl about Clara with the honest affection of someone who had known a good person, and was glad to say so. Pearl listened to this and thought about Clara's things, which she had not disturbed, had in fact taken care not to disturb, had found ways to work around and through the life that had been here before her without erasing any of it. She thought this was right. You did not erase the life that had been here before. She said the garden was hers. Luz said, she started it. I kept it. Now you're planning it. Pearl said, that seems right. Luz said, it is right. Pearl thought about the 3 women and the 1 garden. Clara, who had started it. Luz, who had maintained it. Pearl, who was planning it 2 years out. A garden that had gone from one woman's hands to another's over 10 years on a limestone hillside above the Pedernales. She thought, I am part of a long thing, not just the beginning of something. She thought, that is not what I expected to feel. She thought, it is right though. In the spring, when the garden went in and the cattle work started again, and the 2 spring hands came back to the Holt Ranch with their matter-of-fact respect and their news from the trail, the deed was already filed, and Pearl Crane Holt had been managing the accounts for 6 months, and the kitchen garden was 1 year closer to being the kitchen garden it was going to be. The hill country was green in the April rain, the limestone pale against the new grass, the cedar smelling of the particular spring smell that was nothing like any other spring Pearl had known. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at it, and she thought, I have been here 6 months. She thought, I will be here next April too. She thought, and the April after that. She thought, I have never before been able to say that. I have never before known where I would be in a year. She went back to the accounts, which were correct and in order, and the kitchen, which was hers and Luz's, and the garden plan, which was drawn 2 seasons ahead, and the house, which had 2 names on its deed in the county records, filed in her own handwriting, in the county records, standing for something real and legal and permanent. That was the word, permanent. She had not had a permanent thing in 4 years. She had it now. On a morning in early May, Jed said at breakfast, Eckhart asked about the garden plan. I told him you were thinking 2 years out. Pearl said, what did he say? Jed said, he said good. That's the right way to think in this soil. Pearl thought about Eckhart at the kitchen table, and Luz in the garden, and Jed at the window looking at what Clara had started. She thought about all the people who had built things in this soil, and thought 2 years out, and been right to do it. She said, I learned that from Luz. Jed said, I know. She said, and the accounts, I learned those from my father, and the law from reading the employment contract, and the horses from watching what you did on the trail. He looked at her. He said, what are you accounting for? She said, I'm accounting for how I got here, what it cost, and what it built. He said, and? She said, the accounting comes out different than it used to. He said, how so? She said, it used to be a list of costs. What I lost, what was taken, what Earl Crane did with 6 years of my life. She looked at her coffee. Now the accounting shows something that was built. I can't show you the exact column where the building starts, but I can show you the result. He said, "What's the result?" She looked at him across the table, the man who had spent $53 on a stranger, who had given her the indenture paper, who had written the 2-week notice clause, who had stood behind her at the gate and not moved, who had waited for her to burn the paper, and she thought about the result. She said, this kitchen, the accounts that are correct, the garden that is going to be right in 2 seasons, the deed in the county records. She paused. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "That's a good accounting." She said yes. It was. It was the best accounting she had ever done, and she intended to keep adding to it, year by year, spring after spring, until the column was as long as the hill country was wide. She had the time for that now. She had all the time there was. There was one more thing she would think of, in the years that followed, as the moment everything settled. It was not the gate. It was not the burning. It was not even the wedding or the deed in the county records. It was a Tuesday morning in late May, a year after Abilene, when she had gone to the kitchen at 5 in the morning to start the fire, and found that Jed had already started it. He had gotten up before her in the dark and built the fire so the kitchen would be warm when she came in, the same way he had apparently always done this. She had not known. Because she had always been first to the kitchen, and had assumed she was first. This one morning she was second. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the going fire and thought about it. About what it meant that he had been doing this every morning for a year, quietly, before she arrived, without mentioning it or requiring anything for it. He had not done it for her. He had done it because the kitchen needed a fire in the morning and he was awake, and that was what you did. She had been awake and starting the fire for the same reason. 2 people, building the same fire for the same reason, from opposite ends of the night. She thought, that is what it is. That is the thing I have been looking for the word for. She thought, 2 people starting the same fire. She went to pour the coffee. She was still smiling when Jed came in from the horses at first light. He noticed. He said, "What?" She said the fire was already going. He said I was up early. She said, "I know." He looked at her smiling into her coffee and he did not say anything. Which was right, because it did not need anything said. He poured his own coffee and sat at the table and looked at the hill country dawn coming up through the kitchen window, and Pearl drank her coffee and thought about all the fires she had started alone, and this one she had not, and what the difference was. The difference was everything. It always had been.